I'd been hit in midair by what they call a dum-dum bullet. It hit me in the right hip, exploded inside me. Part of it went through my left lung and beside me, and he started kicking him violently to make sure there was no sign of life, and firing. And he came over to me, and I just kept my face pressed down into the ground and pretended to be dead. I just didn't make a sound. And a few days before had been our first wedding anniversary. Anne and I were supposed to have our, go out for dinner or whatever it was. But so we put that off until we said we'll do it on Thursday, when on our night off. But unfortunately, the night of the 30th in Banbridge, at the Castle Ballroom, was the last gig, because the following morning, the 31st of July, was when the incident occurred.
Of course. You probably been asked to recall it and go through it so many times, but would you mind taking me back to that night if you could?
The interesting question always is, why did it happen? Well, obviously, on our way back from the gig, one of our lads, our drummer Ray Miller, he decided, because we had the following day off, he was going to go back to his parents in Antrim rather than come back to Dublin with us. And I always remember Ray always drove a BMW, he had this sort of it's kind of a yellowish BMW sports car. I can still see him heading off and after the gig. And so it was 5 of us on the way back. Our trumpet player, Brian McCoy, he always drove our personnel van. We never traveled with the gear. The equipment was gone in another van. And so Brian kept the personnel van at home, and he was so he was driving that. It was lovely, beautiful evening, a more beautiful morning by the time we got out. And normally we'd be gone before the gear, but the ladies at the catering ladies in the hall that night asked us if we'd like something to eat. And because we had the following night off, Fran and I in particular, we said, yeah, we will. We talking to them and relaxing, and we knew there was no great hurry. And so we eventually got in. The gear was gone. Our road manager was called Brian McGuire, and Brian had packed up quickly, got the gear in, and as I say, unusually, he was about 5 minutes ahead of us. So when you come out of that particular venue, you've got to cross over the road and then come down the main road. You cross over is like a road that goes over the main road, and then you drive down, and you had to come to a security barrier where the police would come, and every so often, and they would lift the barrier. It was to stop any terrorist activity. And then we got back turned around and got back onto the main Belfast Dublin road, heading back home. At around must have been around 2:00, we were stopped on the way back by what we thought was a routine army checkpoint. We knew there were UDR people there. We knew the uniforms, and instead of just the normal thing would be that, especially UDR, which was UDR was the largest regiment in the British Army, but at the time it would have been most of the people in the UDR, it stands for Ulster Defence Regiment, would have been locals, and a lot of them were part-time, as opposed to full-time British Army and the other regiments. And so those guys we would have been well known to them, because normally if they stop you, they'd ask you for an autograph, or they'd ask you for and maybe if you had records or whatever it was, and they'd be happy to meet you. But this particular time, we were surprised when they asked us to get out of our personnel van. And so, well, we did. They said they wanted to do a check, and Brian McCoy was, as I say, our trumpet player, Brian, not to be confused with Brian McGuire, but Brian said, he was almost apologetic, and he said, as we've got to get out, these gentlemen want to do a check on the van. And I had, it was new to me, but it was all a big adventure to me. I was a young fella from South Tipperary, you know. It was something that, like being in a movie, you know, you're a kid. And I was fascinated. I saw the guns, the soldiers with the guns, and some of them were hunkered down, and they were actually very pleasant to us. We were told to stand at the side of the road with our hands on our heads. And again, I thought it was like something out of the movies. And I was in the center. There was 5 of us, and Tony Garrity, our guitar player, was on my left, and on Tony's left was Fran O'Toole, our singer. On my right then was Brian McCoy, trumpet player, and on his right was Des McAlea, who was known as Des Lee in the band. And there was actually joking between them. They were joking with us, and it's hard to consider, you know, it's hard to conceive, like, you know, in your head, that these people knew what was going to happen, and yet they were able to joke. And while we were there, I heard somebody behind us at the back of the van. We had a Volkswagen minibus, and they had lifted there's a little back sort of panel on the Volkswagen minibus, because the engine is in the back of those things. And there was a little shelf at the back, so you could open that little sort of the half back window, and there was a shelf there, and the only equipment we carried was Tony's guitar and my bass guitar. And so I heard a click, and I knew somebody was opening my guitar case. So I wasn't taking this thing seriously at all. Yeah. I took my hands down, and I just turned around and walked back 2 or 3 steps. And I asked them to be careful with my bass. It was an unusual bass. It was a Dan Armstrong plexiglass, see-through, like one Kurt Cobain used a guitar version of it. It was see-through, like a glass guitar. It was made from plexiglass. And I loved it. I didn't want anyone touching it, because there was only a few of those guitars. Mine obviously was a bass, but I had one, and Phil Lynott had one from Tin Lizzy, and Barry Devlin had one from Horselips and Wells. There was only Brush Shields had one as well, Brush from Skid Row, and so we're kind of proud of the stuff. And so when I went back and asked him, look, I said, can I help you with that? Because I don't want you to damage my guitar. And they weren't in any way sort of, you know, they weren't nervous or suspicious of my motives, because they knew we were completely harmless people. And I pointed at, I had a little case beside it, a small old-fashioned school case, a little brown case. And they asked me what was in that. And I said, there's effects pedals, which is unusual again for a bass player, because it's usually guitar players that use effects pedals. But I was using a wah-wah pedal and an octave divider, which split the 2 frequencies, the high and the low frequency. I was into the gear at the time. And they were more interested. They asked me, was there any valuables in the case? And in hindsight, I suppose they thought that maybe the money from the gig was in it, you know, but we didn't handle any of that. That would have been gone with the roadie. And so I said no, and they turned me around and punched me in the back and knocked me back into line. But instead of knocking me into the middle, they now knocked me between Brian and Des. So I was actually within touching distance of the back of the van. And then there was this other man appeared on the scene, and he was, without a shadow of a doubt, he was an English officer, very posh.
He showed up. He showed up in a car. I'm correct, right?
I'm not sure. There was a car. A car came up behind us. Now I don't know whether he got out of that or whether he was already there. You know, I imagine, because I didn't see him up until then. He may well have been in that car. I doubt if he had travelled with the others. And he took charge without a shadow of a doubt. You know, he was the one that started. He questioned the soldiers who appeared to be in charge at that stage, and as I say, I worked in London in the financial sector, so I was well used to the various accents, and you know, whether somebody was from the East End or of London, or whether they were posh, or whether they were, you know, the sort of, this guy had a very posh accent. He had you know, I suppose you might call it educated English accent. And basically he changed the orders. The order at the beginning was to take our names and addresses, and he changed that to, he told them that he wanted our names and dates of birth, and that, which I believe now is the procedure. But I was fascinated with this fellow. I thought, you know, he looked almost like a comic strip hero, you know, one of the real deal. He had the fatigues on and slightly different. He had authority. He had a gun at his side and a sidearm, and all of the rest of the joking had stopped, and they were all sort of, now they were standing up and they were sort of doing everything more professionally. And when he arrived, Brian McCoy, who was beside me, he was now on my left since I had been knocked back into the thing. Brian said, nudged my elbow with his, because we had our hands on our heads, you know, like that. He nudged my elbow and he said, don't worry, Steve, this is British Army, we'll be away soon. And he actually used the word British Army. So this was not UDR. And I wouldn't have known the difference other than the accent. But the difference was that he would have been more professional soldier, and the UDR had a bad reputation for, you know, that they were, they could have given people, you know, a hard time or whatever. So Brian was convinced, and Des on the other side said the same thing to me. Don't worry about your gear. The British Army are usually very careful with the gear. So here were two fellas from Northern Ireland, Catholic and Protestant, telling me that, you know, everything will be all right because this was British Army. And I was satisfied at that, although the punch in the back sort of made me a little bit sort of, I felt this wasn't right. But I wasn't really suspicious that there was anything seriously going to happen. And what I didn't know was, none of us saw, was that there was two men placing a 10-pound bomb of commercial explosives underneath the driver's seat. Now, for years we thought that the thing had been put in the back of the van. It wasn't. It was being put under the driver's seat. And we wouldn't have known anything about that, and they would have said, thanks very much for your cooperation, and off you go. And nobody would have known about the roadblock. So we would have been down the road 10 minutes, 10, 15 minutes. Again, for a long time, we were under the impression that there was maybe a longer timing mechanism on it, but we now know from forensics that it was about 10 minutes. So we would have been in Newry, and at best, we would have been just over the board. But probably, I think in Newry. So going through Newry, this thing would have exploded. We would have been, forensics would have shown that there was a bomb on board. And we would have gone down in history as terrorists, carrying maybe a bomb for the IRA or transporting something like that. The frightening thing about that is that, you know, I watched a program recently about Jerry Conlon, one of the men who was sentenced for the Guildford bombings, and the scary thing is that obviously they spent what 16, 17 years in jail for something that they didn't do, but there was a family called the Maguires, Annie Maguire, and they demonized these people because they were related to the gunmen, and they said that this woman knew about it, knew about these innocent men being terrorists, and they actually arrested her and her family, the Maguire. They call them the Maguire Seven, and one of them was a 16-year-old kid. So when I look back on it, I think my wife was only 21, who never knew anything, wouldn't have known the difference between the UDR and UCC, just wouldn't know any of this stuff. That they would have knocked on the door and perhaps arrested her for being, for like they did to, and they would have arrested Fran's wife and Brian's wife, and probably even if you saw the documentary, you saw Fran's father crying, holding onto the coffin when he was being buried. They would have arrested that man as well as, and called him complicit. So this was a horror.
And there would be, you would have like a life sentence of being known as terrorists in history. For all we know, there might be a different Netflix documentary. There might be a Netflix documentary about the band who was smuggling explosives for the IRA, and no one would know any different. Like,
absolutely. But what happened, and I sometimes I reluctantly say this, but the truth is, what happened was, it was just fortunately, was that while they were, these two unfortunate men were planting the bomb underneath a man called Wesley Somerville and another man called Harris Boyle. They were both not only UDR, but they were also UVF, Ulster Volunteer Force, because they were interchangeable, and the thing triggered and blew them to pieces. I mean, their injuries were horrific. Blew parts of them out into the field, completely demolished the van, and as I say, we were close enough to touch it. And if you've seen any photographs of it, you'll see that there was little or nothing left. And when it went off, it was just a surreal thing, and it lifted me up into the air. It blew Des was beside me, and it blew him into the ditch, and there was a field about 3 meters below the road that we were facing with our hands on our heads. And he was blown down into the field below, and into the ditch, where he managed to lie low. And I was blown up into the air, and it was like, I often describe it as, the whole world turned red, and I was everything went into slow motion, and I felt I could think logically, like that I had all the time in the world to work this stuff out in my head. I could hear the gunfire instantly as while I was still in the air. And then I started to fall down through the ditch and the bushes, and my sense of it was a heightened sensitivity. Now, whether that's adrenaline, I don't know. But as I went down, even through my clothes, I could feel every single leaf and bramble and twig as I fell down through the bushes down into the field. It was like I had time to count every one of them. And I in my head, I thought that these soldiers had been attacked, and we were caught in the crossfire. That was the only thing that made sense to me. And I hit the ground really hard. And what I didn't realize was, we think that I had been hit in midair by what they call a dum-dum bullet. And a dum-dum bullet is specially designed so that on impact it explodes. It hit me in the right hip, exploded inside me. Part of it went through my left lung and out under my left arm. So it went right across my body. It exploded into 16 pieces. So I had a lot of serious damage inside. And when I hit slow motion went to very fast, and I hit the ground very hard. And two other bodies fell on top of me. And that was, I think, I can't be sure, but I think it was Fran and Tony. And they got up, and Brian, again, I can't be certain, but I think it was Brian, put his hands under me, under my arms, and tried to drag me, but I was a dead weight. And he dragged me as far as he could into the field. And but I was, as I say, I was a dead weight. I had been shot. I couldn't walk. And he was murdered. The soldiers jumped down into the field and started shooting. They jumped down instantly. And they shot Brian in the back and the head, in the back of the head, and he shot him in the arms. And so he was murdered within a few feet of me. And then they chased. They didn't have far to go. They chased after Fran and Tony, and they were just a couple of yards away from us. And they murdered them. And I heard them dying, begging for their lives. And you often see, reports that Fran was shot in the face 22 times. He wasn't. He was shot 22 times, and 7 of those were in the face. But because that type of damage was enough, once would have been enough to do awful damage, but 7 times is terrible. And the screaming and the shouting, the one thing that sort of I always remember was the obscenities, the cursing, the swearing, the shouting, just the cursing of the soldiers. It was rage, absolute rage. And when everything went quiet, there was just some single shots happening, and it was this soldier walking around firing into the dead bodies to make sure they were, and then got over to where Brian was beside me, and he started kicking him violently to make sure there was no sign of life, and firing. And he came over to me, and I just kept my face pressed down into the ground and pretended to be dead. I just didn't make a sound. And I was waiting for him to shoot. At one stage, I considered getting up and begging for my life, but I'm glad I didn't. I just stayed quiet. And just as he was standing over me, somebody on the road shouted, "Come on, those bastards are dead. I got them with dum-dums." And he just walked away, and he didn't fire into me. After that, after a while, then when they appeared to be gone, I heard a voice calling me. It was Des. He was over by the ditch. And he called Fran, and he called Brian and Tony. There was no answer. And then he called me. And I answered. I just said, he said, "Are you okay?" I said, it's almost comical when you think about it. Irish people, they go into a restaurant, they get a meal that they don't like, and somebody says, "How was that?" And they say, "That's grand," And I actually said that when he said, "Are you okay?" I said, "I'm grand." It was like, but, and then he left, and he got up onto the road, and he eventually got somebody a truck was stopping, truck wouldn't take him, thought he was perhaps part of something. And then there was a young couple in the car, and they brought him in, and he reported it. And I was in the field for about an hour, crawling around and between the bodies and the body parts and all that. And I was, they wouldn't come into the field. The security forces wouldn't come into the field because they thought the bodies might be booby trapped. And well, that's what they said. And then they sent a helicopter in, and eventually they came in and they took me out. I suppose I hope that's not too horrific, but it's that's what happened.
Of course. Do you remember? It's been reported that there were 10 gunmen, and then the fellow with the posh accent came along, making 11. Did it seem to you? Does that number seem about right to you? Did it seem like there was about 10?
Well, I didn't see everybody who was there. I safely say I saw 5. But we're told that there was about 10. But the planning that went into this, took certainly wasn't planned by the people that pulled the triggers that night. It wasn't. It was planned. It was a very, very, and this would be quite relevant now to somebody like yourself living abroad. For a long time we thought that the plan was to just simply to throw a cat among the pigeons and to say that you can't trust anybody, and so we better seal the border. So if you can't trust anybody, we're going to have to do stop and search for everybody, because the Irish politicians, especially around the border counties, Cavan and Monaghan and maybe Donegal, that they didn't want all of this stop and search, because their constituents, living on the border would have been driving into the north. It should be like a quarter of a mile, or a few yards, going to and they get maybe cheaper cigarettes or cheaper petrol. So, the nearest town or shop might be just over the border. So to have a stop and search would have disrupted their lives. So their TDs, their local politicians, or even national politicians would have said, we really don't want that kind of disruptive thing happening. But the British were very keen to curtail the movements of the IRA, because the IRA would commit an atrocity in the north, and then they would cross the border to relative safety. And when I say relative safety, I mean there wouldn't have been that many checks, because in the north you could be on the road 2 minutes and you'd have some, it could be a Scottish regiment, British regiment, could be UDR, whatever, you could be liable to be stopped. That really wasn't the case in the south. So in order to have strict security, this would have worked if they had framed us, because they would have said, who can you trust? And I thought that was about the size of it. But I spent Christmas looking at, I read 14,000 files from our case over Christmas. And
Christmas, excuse me, or?
Yeah, just gone. Yeah, I eventually got the case files, because, as you know, we took a case against the British government, and I'm convinced now that it was a much more ambitious plan, that somebody like yourself or anybody living abroad, because, as you know, there would have been a lot of sympathy for the Republican cause in America and in other countries. And so not only would they have stopped people crossing the border, but they would have stopped people crossing any border, whether it was, so being an Irish person, they would have sent out a message to all of their embassies and to all of the other countries and other governments and said, sorry, but we really have a legitimate reason for stopping every Irish person and checking their passports and finding out. So it would have been incredibly disruptive to every Irish person living abroad on the planet, never mind crossing any border. So at airports, you would have had border crossings throughout Europe as well. I mean, one country into another. And it would have been a very, very convincing argument, to say, look, their most popular pop group were at this. So we can't take any risks.